You needed money even after you died. Just one small coin. Without it, you couldn't get in. People are standing at the edge of a black river. They're all facing the same direction, but no one can cross. In the middle of the water, an old worn boat drifts slowly. And at the end of that boat stands a single ferryman. Who is he? In Greek mythology, he's the one who carries the dead to the other side. His name is Charon. Here's what makes him truly unsettling, though. He doesn't attack you like a monster. He doesn't scream. He doesn't chase anyone. He just decides who gets on the boat, and who doesn't. And the rule is almost shockingly simple. One coin, placed in the mouth of the dead. A sign that someone prepared you for the final road. No coin, no crossing. You stay on the shore. Picture it, and it becomes even more disturbing. Your life is already over. You can't go back. The other side is right there in front of you. You can almost feel that once you reach it, things will finally settle. Finally be still, but you have to stop, right at the edge. Why? Because you don't have the fare. Turned away at the door even after death. That idea is colder than it first sounds. The ancient Greeks didn't imagine the afterlife as just a vague, shapeless fog. They believed the dead had to cross some kind of boundary, a body of water between two worlds. We often call it the River Styx, though in other traditions it appears as the Charon. The names shift depending on the source, and the details vary, but the core idea stays the same. There is a clear border between the living and the dead, and you cannot cross it alone. Charon was the one who took you across. This myth has lasted not simply because it feels dark or eerie. It's lasted because it feels real. The things that make people most anxious tend to follow the same pattern. There's a door, but you can't get through it. It's your turn, but it never comes. You're almost there, and then you stop at the very last step. Charon's river takes all of that and maps it onto what waits after death. Charon is widely known as the ferryman of the underworld. In classical sources, he's described as the figure who carries the dead across the rivers of the underworld, whether named Styx or Charon, in exchange for a coin, placed in or on the mouth of the dead. Later traditions gave this coin a name, Charon's obol. It became tied to actual burial practices in the ancient world. So this isn't some vague rumor that floated around the internet. It was a belief woven into real funeral customs, and it held its shape across centuries. Why a coin, though? Why placed in the mouth? When someone died in the ancient world, the living prepared them for what came next. The body was washed, anointed, mourned, and sent off through a careful series of rituals. And somewhere in that process, a coin was placed with them. This wasn't just superstition. It may have been a way of saying, this person is not going alone. Proof that someone took responsibility for their final journey. That's where the first meaning surfaces. What the ancient Greeks may have feared most wasn't death itself. It was the idea of dying and having no one there to send you off. No one to follow the rituals, no one to prepare you for the road ahead. In this myth, the coin isn't really about money. It's more like a mark that says, you were not forgotten. That's what makes it sad. And that's what makes it feel so human. The specific amount mattered less than the gesture itself. One obol is the most commonly cited version, but some sources mention two, and others reference different coins entirely, like the denate. The details shift. The center holds. The dead needed a small coin for the final crossing, and the living were the ones who provided it. In that sense, Charon's coin was both a toll for the underworld and a form of grief from the world above. There's something strange in that idea, if you sit with it. We often think of death as the moment when all conditions fall away. No more rules, no more checkpoints. But the ancient Greeks thought the opposite. No, there's still one more step. One last threshold. One last check. One last passage to be made. They placed death itself inside a structure, inside a set of rules. Why? Because when something is too vast and too unknown to face directly, rules make it easier to carry. A clear procedure is less terrifying than an open void. That's why Charon reads less like a monster and more like a system. In the world of Hades, he doesn't operate on feeling. He doesn't make exceptions. He doesn't soften when someone weeps. Rules match, you board. Rules don't match, you stay. That's what makes him frightening in a specific way. Malice can sometimes be argued with. Principle cannot. There's a big difference between someone blocking you out of anger and someone simply saying, "Not yet." We all know how that difference feels. So what actually happened to those who had no coin? A lot of retellings go straight to wandering souls, lost forever. But the older sources are more precise than that. Some describe souls without proper burial or payment lingering near the riverbank. In Virgil's Aeneid, one of the most well-known depictions in the Roman literary tradition, those who were never buried are shown, waiting on the shore for 100 years before they're finally allowed to cross. So the core of it isn't infinite horror. It's the state of not yet being received, suspended, held at the edge. That's somehow more disturbing than endless punishment, because it feels closer to something real. 100 years. That number carries weight. The image of someone being actively punished fades. The image of someone simply left at the water's edge lingers. Because sometimes what people fear most isn't suffering. It's waiting, thinking it's over, and finding out it isn't. Standing in front of a door that almost opens, and watching it stay shut. Time passing with nothing happening, and that nothing stretching out endlessly. That's where the real unease in the Charon myth lives. Which brings us to a second way of reading all of this. What makes this myth so unsettling isn't that the underworld is dark. It's that it's bureaucratic. No flames. No dramatic final judgment. Just a cue, a qualification, and a pass or fail. People have always found exclusion harder to bear than punishment. Charon is the face of that exclusion. He doesn't need to raise his voice to be frightening. The River Styx itself is worth pausing on. It wasn't just a spooky backdrop. In Greek mythology, the Styx was also the river, by which even the gods swore their most binding oaths. To break a vow made on the Styx was something even divine beings couldn't do lightly. So this river wasn't just water. It was the idea of crossing a line you can't uncross. Once you go over, there's no coming back. And if you can't cross, you belong to neither side. The Greeks shaped that dangerous in-between into a river, and they made Charon its keeper. The line between life and death, between memory and forgetting, between those who were mourned, and those who were not. That black river was, in a way, the sum of all those thresholds at once. Which is part of why Charon shows up so often. In what survives from the ancient world. Small oil flasks, funerary pottery, like lekythoi, inscriptions relating to burial coins. Modern museums treat Charon not simply as a symbolic character, but as a genuine window into how ancient people imagined death and what came after. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, for example, describes the obol as Charon's fee, noting that those without proper burial were said to remain on the shore. What that tells us is fairly direct. Charon wasn't just a story. He was a figure people actually called to mind. When thinking about someone's final moments, imagine it one more time. Charon stands on the boat and says nothing. A soul stands at the water's edge, crossing over from one world into the next. In that moment, the thing that matters most isn't power, reputation, or anything accumulated over a lifetime. It's one small coin, and a final farewell that was properly given. Strange, isn't it? Everything built up over a life. All the things that felt so important while you were living carry almost no weight on that shore. What's left at the end isn't the size of what you achieved. It's whether someone was there to see you off. This is a myth, and yet somehow it doesn't feel like one. Because what people hold onto at the very end might be something small rather than something grand. You could ask whether the ancient Greeks really believed all of this literally. What seems clear is that they didn't treat it as pure fantasy. It was built into funeral culture, carved into artifacts, and returned to again and again, in poetry, tragedy, and epic. That means this myth wasn't just a frightening story. It was a way of understanding life and death, a picture of what came after, and a framework That gave the living a reason to do what needed to be done. And that raises one more interesting question. Is Charon the frightening thing? Or is it the world that requires him? Look at him carefully, and he isn't making arbitrary judgments. He's operating within a fixed boundary, carrying out a fixed role. Which means what unsettles people isn't really his personality. It's the fact that life and death are divided so cleanly. Cross, and you don't come back. Fail to cross, and you're left behind. That sharp, clear line is what keeps this myth alive across centuries. One more thing that makes the Charon myth enduring is that fear and grief sit inside the same image. The soul standing at the water's edge is unsettling to picture, but it's also heartbreaking. You don't want to imagine someone you love left standing there alone. And that's likely why the living prepared the coin, carried out the rituals, and took care of every step with such intention. It was about following the rules, yes, but it was also about love. Ancient funeral rites weren't just formality. They were a promise: I'll take you this far. I won't leave you without what you need. That's the third way to read this myth. At its center isn't fear. It's the farewell. The coin is a toll for the underworld, but it's also the last thing the living hand to the dead. Don't go alone. Don't lose your way. We're with you until here. What the ancient Greeks put into that small piece of metal wasn't monetary value. It was relational value. And that's why this myth feels cold on the surface, but leaves something tender underneath when you reach the end. That pull we feel toward this story makes sense. Because all of us, at some point, will stand at some kind of threshold. Not necessarily death. Life has its own borders. Moments where going back isn't possible. But moving forward requires something you don't yet have. Moments where crossing alone isn't an option. Where you need someone's help, or permission, or simply their presence. The myth of Charon and the Styx takes that universal human experience and pushes it to its furthest edge. That's why a story this old doesn't feel distant at all. There's also something worth noticing about the way Charon is associated with silence. We tend to picture powerful figures as loud, forceful, overwhelming. Charon is the opposite. No noise, no drama. He holds the oar, he watches, he divides, he carries some and leaves others. That's it, and that simplicity is exactly what makes him so unnerving. Sometimes what shrinks us most isn't the loudest thread in the room. It's the one that quietly excludes us without saying a word. So calling Charon simply a scary ferryman of the underworld doesn't quite cover it. He's a guardian of the boundary, a symbol of how death was woven into ritual and meaning. Evidence that even at the very end, people needed structure to make the unbearable bearable. And he's also a keeper of the farewell. That thing the living refused to let go of even in their grief. Fear, order, loss, and love all fold into one figure. The short version of this story hits hard. The longer you look at it, the deeper it goes. In the end, what the myth of Charon and the River Styx might be telling us is this: people didn't want to imagine death as something that happens entirely alone. Even at the last moment, they needed someone's gesture, someone's preparation, someone's memory. The ancient Greeks compressed all of that into a single coin. So that small piece of metal was a toll and a comfort at once. A rule and an act of love at the same time. A myth and something very close to real. Look back at that opening image now, and it reads differently. Souls standing at the edge of a black river. One old, worn boat. Charon gripping the oar in silence. At first it seems like nothing more than a dark and frightening scene. But underneath it is something the living couldn't let go of. The desire to send someone off properly. The hope that at the very end, they wouldn't lose their way. So this isn't simply a story about the terrors of the underworld. It might be, in one of the oldest ways we know, a story about what it means to say goodbye. And that's why Charon is still remembered, thousands of years later. Not only because he's the ferryman of the dead, but because he shows us, with striking clarity, that, even at the end of a life, people needed the touch of another person. Crossing that black river didn't require a miracle, just one small coin, and the proof that someone, somewhere, had not forgotten you. The ancient Greeks believed that was the most important thing to have when standing at the final threshold. And honestly, that belief doesn't feel all that far away, even now.